The sun had barely risen over the quiet town of Oakwood when the storm hit. From the outside, Jordan King's house looked like any other, a modest, two-story home on the edge of a peaceful residential street. The scent of fresh coffee and bacon wafted through the air as Jordan kissed his wife, Maya, goodbye for the day. His kids, Alana and Chris, rushed around the kitchen, scrambling to get ready for school, with the usual chaos that accompanied mornings in any busy household. It was the kind of day that felt ordinary, predictable. Yet, for Jordan, it would be the day everything changed. Jordan wasn't anyone special. He wasn't a politician, a criminal, or a big shot in any community organization. He was just a mechanic, a simple man who took pride in fixing cars, spending time with his family, and enjoying the quiet life Oakwood had to offer. He had no enemies, no secrets. He didn't live in a mansion or drive a luxury car. He didn't even think about politics or anything beyond making ends meet. It was a life he was content with. But all of that was about to come crashing down in an instant. It started as a typical morning. After his family left for work and school, Jordan pulled on his worn-out overalls and made his way to the shop, as he did every day. The hum of the engines and the steady rhythm of his tools were comforting to him. The hours passed slowly, as they always did, until suddenly, there was a sharp knock on the garage door. He looked up from the engine he was working on, a little puzzled. No one ever knocked on the door like that unless they were a customer. But this wasn't just any customer. He stood up and wiped his hands on a rag, then headed to the door. As soon as he opened it, the weight of the situation became clear. "Mr. King?" A voice barked from the other side, though the man standing before him wasn't a friendly face. He was wearing a bulletproof vest, carrying a firearm, and standing beside a small group of officers who appeared just as tense. "What's going on?" Jordan asked, his heart skipping a beat. Something in the air had shifted, but he couldn't quite place what. The officer didn't respond immediately. He just motioned toward the small black SUV parked behind them, and Jordan noticed two unmarked police cars idling further down the street. His stomach churned as his mind began to race. "Sir, I need you to come with us," the officer finally said. "You're under investigation. We have a warrant for your arrest and a search of your property." The words didn't quite register at first. It was too surreal. Jordan wasn't a criminal, he had no idea why they were raiding his shop. His mind was foggy with confusion and fear. "What? Why? What did I do?" Jordan stammered, a mix of disbelief and panic rising in his chest. "We'll explain everything shortly, Mr. King," the officer responded coldly, though there was something unreadable in his eyes. "But for now, we need you to cooperate." Before Jordan could protest, they were already inside, the officers moving quickly and efficiently, rummaging through drawers, flipping over tools, and scanning the garage with their eyes, clearly searching for something. Jordan felt like he had stepped into a nightmare. His heart raced as he watched them go through his personal belongings, turning his life upside down. It all felt wrong, like a cruel joke. He didn't know what they were looking for or why he was being treated like a suspect in a major crime. He thought of his wife, his kids, at home, completely unaware of what was happening. The life they had built together, the life he had worked so hard for, was being shredded in front of his eyes. "Sir, please step outside," another officer ordered, and without another word, they guided him out of the garage and into the cool morning air. He couldn't even find the words to protest as he was led toward a waiting car. There was no explanation, no reasoning. He was just a man caught in the middle of something he didn't understand. Minutes turned into hours. The officers scoured his property, asking questions he couldn't answer. He felt like a puppet, powerless in a world that had suddenly turned upside down. But then, just as Jordan was beginning to grasp the enormity of what was happening, something unexpected occurred. A car drove up, another unmarked police vehicle. Jordan didn't recognize the officer who got out, but the way they carried themselves, the seriousness in their eyes, suggested they were someone important. "Is he the one?" the officer asked in a low voice as they walked up to the group. The rest of the officers stiffened, and a strange hush fell over the scene. Jordan's mind raced. Who was this person? Why did everyone suddenly seem so tense? Yes, the officer who had initially spoken nodded. This is the one. Without explanation, the new officer walked straight toward Jordan, making no effort to disguise the weight of the moment. "Mr. King," the officer said, his voice surprisingly calm, "I'm sorry for the confusion. We'll need to clear a few things up. But I have to tell you something first. You've just been selected as the new chief of police for Oakwood." Jordan's brain couldn't process the words at first. Chief of police? Him? This was a mistake. There had to be some mistake. Why would they choose him for something like that? He wasn't a cop. He wasn't even involved in law enforcement. He had no experience, no connections, nothing that could explain why they would offer him such a position. "What are you talking about?" Jordan stammered, his voice rising in panic. "I'm not the chief. I'm just a mechanic. There's no way." But the officer, now standing tall and serious, didn't flinch. "We've been watching you, Mr. King. Your integrity, your connection to this community, it's exactly what we need right now. You've been chosen. There's no turning back now." The words hit Jordan like a sledgehammer. The shock was overwhelming. He didn't know whether to be angry or confused. In an instant, his life had gone from ordinary to extraordinary. His mind spun as he tried to grasp the situation. He was being asked to become the chief of police of Oakwood, a role he had never wanted, never sought, and never thought possible. But the officer's words weren't the only thing that troubled Jordan. There was something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface. The whole situation felt off. Why was this happening now, under such strange circumstances? The raid, the sudden promotion, the way everything was unfolding so quickly, none of it made sense. And yet, as Jordan stood there in the cold, surrounded by officers who were suddenly treating him with respect and reverence, he realized one painful truth: he had no choice. The future of Oakwood, and his place in it, had just been decided. And it was going to be a ride like no other. Jordan sat in stunned silence as the officer's words echoed in his mind. Chief of Police. The thought barely registered. The entire situation felt like some bad dream, a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. His hands trembled as he clutched the seat of the car, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He glanced out of the window, barely noticing the familiar streets of Oakwood as they passed by. The whole town had always been so simple, so quiet, just the kind of place where nothing extraordinary ever happened. Yet here he was, being pulled into the center of a storm he couldn't comprehend. The officer who had delivered the shocking news, Captain Harris, seemed to be lost in his own thoughts as they drove through the town, which had begun to wake up for the day. People were walking their dogs, sipping coffee on porches, and the usual morning hum of Oakwood was in full swing. Yet for Jordan, nothing seemed normal anymore. The officer didn't speak for what felt like an eternity, and Jordan, still in a daze, couldn't find the words to ask what he had to ask. He knew he needed answers, but his mind was too foggy to process anything. Finally, Captain Harris broke the silence. "You probably don't understand why this is happening. You're probably asking yourself how a guy like you, a mechanic, ends up as the chief of police. And honestly, I can't blame you. This isn't how it was supposed to go. But we don't have a lot of time, Jordan. I'm going to need you to trust me." His voice was steady, almost too calm for the gravity of the situation, but Jordan could sense the urgency in it. Trust him? Jordan couldn't even trust himself right now. But there was no turning back. He was in too deep, caught in something far bigger than him. He tried to speak but his throat felt dry. How could he possibly trust anyone in a moment like this? Listen, Captain Harris continued, his eyes focused on the road ahead, I know this is overwhelming. Hell, I've been in your shoes before, just in a different way. But you have to understand something. Oakwood needs you. You've been chosen because you're the only one who can make the changes we need. This town, it's been sliding for years, and no one's been able to do anything about it. It's fallen through the cracks, and people are getting desperate. They don't trust the system anymore. But you're different. You have the community's trust. They believe in you. You're the only person who can bring this town back. Jordan could hardly believe what he was hearing. What did Captain Harris mean by, bring this town back? Oakwood had its issues, like any small town, but nothing that Jordan had ever thought needed radical change. He was just a guy trying to live a simple life, to fix cars and be with his family. What did he know about running a police department, much less leading a town out of a crisis? You've got to be kidding me, Jordan muttered under his breath, shaking his head. I'm not qualified for this. I'm not even a cop. I don't know anything about law enforcement. Captain Harris nodded, as if he expected Jordan to say exactly that. I understand. Believe me, I do. But the people who've been in charge? They've let the system get corrupt. We need someone who sees things differently, someone who doesn't have the baggage, who isn't tied to the old ways of doing things. You don't have that. You're the outsider, Jordan. That's why we need you. Jordan couldn't wrap his head around it. He couldn't help but feel a sense of dread rising in his chest. Being the chief of police was a huge responsibility. It wasn't something he could just accept without thinking it through. It wasn't like fixing an engine, there were no simple solutions here, no way to just wrench things into place and expect everything to run smoothly. His thoughts went to Maya and the kids. How would they feel about this? How would they handle the pressure that would come with him being in the public eye, a place he had never wanted to be? They turned a corner, and the Oakwood Police Department loomed ahead. The building, a modest structure made of brick, sat quietly at the center of town, as if it were just another part of the backdrop. But now, as Jordan's gaze fell on it, it felt like it was calling to him, a symbol of the weight that was about to be placed on his shoulders. They pulled into the parking lot, and Captain Harris motioned for Jordan to follow him. Jordan's legs felt like lead as he stepped out of the car, his stomach in knots. He had no idea what to expect next, but he was about to find out. Inside the department, things were already in motion. Officers were hustling between desks, filing paperwork, answering calls. There was a low hum of activity, but it was far from the chaos that Jordan had imagined when he first heard police department. It felt almost ordinary. There was a sense of professionalism in the air, but nothing like the high-stakes drama he'd seen on TV. Yet, for all its normalcy, there was something deeply unsettling about the place. It felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Captain Harris led Jordan down a long corridor, past the open doors of offices filled with officers and detectives. There were no grand gestures, no red carpet. Jordan wasn't treated like some hero, he was treated like a man walking into a job he hadn't asked for. The moment felt surreal, as if he was an imposter in a world he didn't belong in. Finally, they reached a door at the end of the hall. Captain Harris knocked twice before opening it. Inside, the room was stark, with a large desk covered in papers and a few chairs scattered around the room. Behind the desk sat Mayor Elena Morales, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s with dark hair and a no-nonsense attitude. She looked up as they entered, her expression unreadable. "Mr. King," she said, her voice firm. "I trust you've had a chance to think about what we've discussed." Jordan barely knew what to say. His mind was still reeling from everything that had happened, and now, he was being thrust into a conversation that felt miles above his pay grade. I don't know what to think," he said finally, his voice shaking slightly. This is too much. I'm not qualified. I'm just a mechanic. I'm not a police officer. Mayor Morales nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his. We know that, Mr. King. But this isn't about qualifications. It's about leadership. You've shown us, through your actions and your reputation, that you have what it takes to lead. This town needs someone who can bring the community back together, someone who isn't bound by the old ways. We believe you're that person. Jordan looked around the room, at the walls lined with awards and plaques, at the faces of the officers who were now waiting for him to make a decision that would change everything. He felt the weight of the moment settle in. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the entire town of Oakwood. The decision wasn't his to make. Not really. He could refuse, but he knew what that would mean. They had set this in motion, and now, he had to play along, whether he liked it or not. He was being asked to step into a role he never wanted, never planned for. But there was no turning back now. Mayor Morales leaned forward slightly, her eyes softening. You don't have to do this alone. We'll support you, every step of the way. But Oakwood is counting on you. Don't let them down. Jordan stood there for a moment, lost in the weight of it all. The man he had been, the man who was content with his life, was gone. And in his place stood someone who was about to take on a responsibility he never thought he'd be prepared for. His heart pounded in his chest as he took a deep breath, knowing that his life, and the future of Oakwood, were about to be forever changed. He nodded slowly, though his mind was still in turmoil. Okay, he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. I'll do it. And with that, his life as he knew it was over. A new chapter, one filled with unimaginable challenges and responsibilities, had just begun. The days that followed Jordan's reluctant acceptance of the position felt like a whirlwind, his mind racing with questions that had no easy answers. He was thrust into the life of a police officer, but not in the way anyone would expect. There were no long hours of training, no gradual build-up to the complexities of law enforcement. Instead, it was an instant immersion, a crash course into a world he was woefully unprepared for. His first day in the office was an overwhelming mix of meetings, phone calls, and paperwork. But none of that prepared him for what awaited him on the streets of Oakwood. The weight of the badge around his neck felt like a physical presence, heavy and unforgiving. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw someone he didn't recognize, a man with responsibilities that stretched far beyond what he thought he could handle. But no one was going to wait for him to adjust. The town had chosen him, whether he was ready or not. Jordan's first challenge came within hours of his appointment. The phone call came through just as he was sitting at his new desk, trying to familiarize himself with the dizzying stack of reports and documents that had been left for him. The voice on the other end was urgent, clipped. "Chief, we've got a situation downtown," the dispatcher said. "A large group of protesters, and it's getting ugly." Jordan's heart raced. Protests were nothing new to Oakwood, but this was different. This wasn't some small gathering demanding a stoplight or a new park. This was something bigger, something that could escalate quickly if not handled properly. He hadn't even been sworn in yet. How could he manage a crowd of angry people, some of whom might be demanding answers he didn't have? But there was no time to second-guess himself. He grabbed his jacket and headed straight for the door. Officer Daniels, one of the senior officers on the force, was already waiting in the parking lot. Daniels was a seasoned cop, with a no-nonsense attitude and a reputation for getting things done. He had been one of the few officers who had welcomed Jordan's appointment, though Jordan could sense the skepticism that lingered behind his professional demeanor. "We need to get there fast," Daniel said, his voice steady as he climbed into the passenger seat of the squad car. "This could get out of hand, Chief. These people are angry, and it's not just about the usual town politics. It's something deeper. I've seen the signs." Jordan's mind was already reeling. He could only imagine what was going on. Oakwood had been a quiet town, yes, but there were cracks, hidden issues that no one liked to talk about. Economic struggles, a rising sense of division, and whispers of corruption within local politics. Was this the result of everything that had been simmering under the surface? The squad car screeched to a halt at the edge of the crowd. What Jordan saw when he stepped out was nothing like he had imagined. The streets were filled with people, men and women of all ages, from every walk of life. They stood in tight groups, holding signs and chanting slogans. Some were angry, others just disillusioned, but there was an unmistakable sense of unrest in the air. Jordan's eyes darted over the scene. He saw the frustration in the faces of the protesters, people demanding change, justice, and transparency. But what was it all about? What had pushed Oakwood's citizens to this point? He knew he needed to act quickly, or the situation could escalate into something far more dangerous. Officer Daniels was already talking to a group of officers, strategizing the best way to approach the crowd. Jordan could feel the eyes of the protesters on him as he walked forward. His every step felt heavy, the weight of his new role pressing down on him like a 1,000-pound weight. He had to do something, he had to speak, to show the people that their concerns weren't falling on deaf ears. But what could he say? He was just a guy who had been handed the keys to a city's future. He wasn't some seasoned politician or public speaker. "All right, Chief," Daniels said, pulling him out of his thoughts. "This is your call. What do you want to do?" Jordan hesitated. He looked at the protesters again, seeing the deep hurt in their eyes, the anger that bubbled just beneath the surface. They weren't there just to cause trouble. They were there because they felt like they had been ignored for too long. They had no faith in the system, no faith in the people who had run Oakwood for years. And now, Jordan was the face of that system, whether he liked it or not. "I need to speak to them," Jordan said finally, his voice more steady than he felt. He turned to Daniels. "I don't know what they want, but I'm going to find out." With a deep breath, Jordan walked toward the crowd. As he approached, the noise began to die down. Eyes turned toward him, some skeptical, others filled with curiosity. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't a cop. He was just a man trying to do the right thing, trying to keep his town from falling apart. He raised his hand for silence, and to his surprise, the crowd quieted. There was an intensity in the air, a silent demand for him to speak, to say something that would make them believe that things could change. He stood there for a moment, gathering his thoughts. He had never been a public speaker, never had to address a crowd of this size, but he knew one thing for sure: this wasn't the time for platitudes or rehearsed speeches. This was about honesty. "My name is Jordan King," he began, his voice stronger than he felt. "And I'm your new chief of police." He let the words settle in. He could see the skeptical glances, the eyes narrowing. He was just the mechanic to them, not someone they'd ever expect to lead them. But he had no choice. This was the role he had been handed, and he wasn't going to shy away from it. "I know that things haven't been right in Oakwood. I know that you feel like the system has failed you," he continued, his words coming from a place of sincerity. "I'm not here to give you false promises or pretend like everything will be fine. But I am here to listen. I'm here to make things better, to earn back your trust. If you'll give me the chance, I'll do everything I can to fix this town." There was a long pause. The crowd was silent, waiting. Jordan felt like the whole world was holding its breath. He could see the doubt in their eyes, but there was something else too, something softer. Hope, maybe. Or was it just the desire for change? "I'm not perfect," Jordan said, his voice quieter now. "I don't have all the answers. But I'm not going to sit back and let Oakwood fall apart. Not on my watch." There was a long pause before someone in the crowd shouted, "Prove it." And then, slowly, murmurs began to spread throughout the group. It wasn't the immediate uproar he had feared, but the atmosphere was still tense. He wasn't out of the woods yet. But he had made a start. Jordan turned to Daniels, who gave him a subtle nod. The officers began to break up the crowd, guiding protesters to a more manageable area, but there was no violence, no chaos. The tension still hung thick in the air, but the crowd had heard him. And for the first time since he had stepped into this role, Jordan felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could do this. He could change Oakwood, one step at a time. As they made their way back to the station, Jordan's thoughts were still swirling. He didn't know if he had said the right thing or if his words would have any lasting impact. But one thing was clear, this wasn't going to be easy. Oakwood's problems ran deep, and he was now in the thick of it. He wasn't just the chief of police, he was the man who had to rebuild this town's trust. And that was going to take more than speeches and promises. It was going to take action. It was going to take everything he had. The days following Jordan's first encounter with the protesters were a blur. His role as chief of police was no longer a theoretical concept, it had become a brutal reality, and he could feel the weight of the position in every step he took. Every decision felt monumental. One wrong move, one misstep, could unravel everything. Oakwood was looking to him to restore order, to prove that he could make things right. But Jordan knew he was just beginning to grasp the magnitude of what lay ahead. The first week was filled with long meetings and a series of tense confrontations. The town was divided, and it was clear that Oakwood's issues went far beyond the immediate crisis. The protesters were only a visible symptom of a much deeper discontent. Crime rates had risen in recent years, local businesses were struggling, and, perhaps most concerning of all, corruption within the town's police force had left a sour taste in the mouths of the people. Jordan had been thrust into the position not because he was a seasoned lawman, but because he was seen as an outsider, someone who could break the old guard and bring in something new. But the challenge was gargantuan. His first official meeting with the department was tense. Officers filed in one by one, their expressions varying from skepticism to resignation. There was no welcoming applause, no warm handshake. Just quiet stares, some filled with suspicion, others tinged with curiosity. They weren't sure what to make of the mechanic-turned-chief, and Jordan could hardly blame them. If the tables had been turned, he would have questioned him too. He was far from the polished, experienced leaders who usually sat in the chief's chair. He was a man from the working class, thrust into a system that had no room for uncertainty. At the front of the room sat Captain Harris, who had been one of the few supporters of Jordan's appointment. But even Harris, with all his years of service, couldn't disguise the tension in his posture. "All right, Chief," Harris began, his tone respectful but measured. "We're here to hear your thoughts. The department's been through a lot, and we all know this isn't just about policy changes. It's about trust. You've got our attention, but you're going to have to show us what you've got." Jordan stood up, feeling the eyes of every officer in the room on him. His palms were sweaty, and his heart was pounding. He had no grand speech prepared, no neat little list of promises. All he had was his resolve, and the belief that Oakwood deserved better than what it had been getting. "I don't have the answers yet," Jordan said, his voice steady despite the nerves clawing at his insides. "But I know one thing, we can't keep doing things the way we've always done them. The town is hurting. The people are hurting. And I won't sit in this office while things continue to fall apart. We've got to rebuild trust, not just with the community, but with each other." He could see the officers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some nodded slowly, while others exchanged glances. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with uncertainty. Jordan knew that words alone wouldn't change their perceptions. He had to show them he meant what he said, that he wasn't just another political pawn. "The first thing I'm going to do," Jordan continued, "is listen. We're going to have community meetings, we're going to hear their concerns, and we're going to do something about them. I'm not here to protect the old guard or uphold the status quo. I'm here to rebuild this department, to make it one that the people can believe in again. And if anyone has a problem with that, now's the time to speak up." For a long moment, the room was silent. Jordan could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. He knew that many of the officers had already made up their minds about him. But there was no going back now. He had to keep pushing forward, even if it felt like he was walking on a razor's edge. Finally, Captain Harris spoke up. "You're asking for a lot, Chief. You're asking us to believe that things can change, that we can do better. But that's going to take time. We've got a lot of damage to undo." "I know," Jordan said quietly. "But we don't have time to waste. We've got a town to save." The meeting ended without fanfare, but as Jordan walked out of the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The officers weren't exactly on his side, but they hadn't outright rejected him either. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The real challenge came when Jordan decided to follow through on his promise to engage with the community. He had to confront the town's darkest issues head-on, even if it meant alienating more people along the way. The first of the community meetings was scheduled for the following week, and Jordan was determined to make it work. He knew it was a gamble. The people of Oakwood were skeptical of the system, and they had every right to be. They weren't interested in more speeches or empty promises. They wanted results. The evening of the first meeting arrived, and Jordan found himself standing at the front of a small community hall, facing a crowd of concerned citizens. The room was filled with familiar faces, people he had known his whole life, people who had always been friendly, kind-hearted, and supportive. But tonight, they were different. Their faces were lined with frustration, their eyes filled with a sense of betrayal. It was hard to deny the palpable tension in the room. Jordan stepped up to the microphone, his mind racing. He had no script, no pre-written speech. All he had was his truth, raw and unfiltered. "I'm not here to tell you things are going to get better overnight," Jordan began, his voice steady but tinged with the gravity of the moment. "I know you've been let down by this town's leadership. I know that Oakwood has become a place where people feel like they don't matter, that their voices don't count. But I'm here to tell you that I hear you. I see you. And I'm not going to walk away from this. We're going to fix this together." For the next hour, Jordan listened. He listened to the stories of mothers whose children had fallen into the cracks of a failing system. He heard from business owners who were struggling to keep their doors open while crime rates skyrocketed. He listened to the frustration of officers who had been forced to turn a blind eye to the very corruption that had brought Oakwood to its knees. Each story, each voice added another layer to the mountain of problems Jordan had to face. But amid the chaos of anger and distrust, there was something else, a spark of hope. People began to speak not just of what was wrong, but what could be. A few mentioned that the town could become something better, that there was still a chance. And that hope was contagious. The meeting ended on a quiet note. No one left with all the answers, but there was a sense of camaraderie that had been missing for a long time. For the first time in weeks, Jordan allowed himself to feel the faintest flicker of optimism. He wasn't alone in this fight. The town was behind him, whether he fully realized it or not. But as he walked out of the hall that night, a feeling of unease settled over him. There was more at play in Oakwood than he had originally thought. There were whispers, things Jordan wasn't aware of, things that had been kept in the shadows. The deeper he went into this, the more he realized that his job wasn't just about leading a police force, it was about uncovering the hidden truths of Oakwood, about dismantling the corruption that had taken root and held the town hostage for years. The road ahead was going to be harder than he imagined, and the stakes had just been raised. But one thing was certain, he couldn't turn back now. Oakwood was counting on him, and no matter what, Jordan King was going to see this through to the end. The weeks that followed the community meeting were a blur of hard decisions, long nights, and overwhelming pressure. Jordan felt like a man standing on a cliff, watching the world below him teeter on the edge of collapse. Oakwood's problems ran deep, and the complexities of his new role were slowly unfolding before him in ways he could never have anticipated. Every corner he turned revealed something new, something that required his attention, sometimes with urgency, sometimes with a quiet intensity that gnawed at him. He was starting to understand the enormity of his task. The people had placed their hopes in him, but how could he live up to such an expectation when he was still learning the ropes of his own job? One afternoon, as Jordan sat in his office sorting through a mountain of reports, there came a knock at the door. It was Officer Daniels, looking more serious than usual. His face had the weight of someone bearing troubling news. "We need to talk," Daniels said, stepping into the room without waiting for an invitation. "It's about Detective Fisher." Jordan's brow furrowed. "What about Fisher?" Daniels hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. "There's been some unusual activity coming from his end. I don't have all the details, but we need to keep an eye on him." Jordan leaned back in his chair, the words sinking in. Detective Fisher had been with Oakwood PD for years, one of the most trusted officers on the force. He was known for his sharp mind, his attention to detail, and his dedication to getting the job done. If Daniels was concerned, it was serious. "What kind of activity?" Jordan asked, his voice steady, though his mind was already racing. "I've been getting reports from some of the officers, mostly informal, about Fisher's behavior," Daniels replied. "Late-night meetings with some unsavory individuals, unusual phone calls, things that don't seem right. I don't have the proof, but we can't ignore the signs." Jordan rubbed his temples, trying to clear his mind. The last thing Oakwood needed was internal corruption, especially now, when the department was already under intense scrutiny. He had barely begun to rebuild trust with the community, and a scandal like this could destroy everything. "We'll need to investigate," Jordan said after a moment. "But we need to be careful. If Fisher is involved in something shady, it could take the entire department down with him. I need you to gather some more information, discreetly. We'll keep it quiet for now." Daniels nodded, his eyes hardening with determination. "Understood. I'll handle it." As Daniels left his office, Jordan's mind raced. Fisher had been one of the department's most reliable officers. The idea that he could be involved in anything corrupt felt almost impossible to believe. But deep down, Jordan knew he couldn't afford to be naive. He had to be vigilant, even if it meant turning against the very people who had helped him take this job. The weight of leadership was beginning to crush him. Every decision felt like it could be his last. He had already promised the town that things would change, that Oakwood would no longer be held hostage by corruption and dysfunction. But now, the very people he had hoped to rely on might be part of the problem. That evening, after a long day of meetings and phone calls, Jordan found himself at home, pacing back and forth in the living room. His mind was overwhelmed with the responsibilities of his position. There were budget meetings to attend, strategies to develop, and now an internal investigation hanging over his head. The enormity of the task was suffocating. He had never expected any of this when he took on the role of chief. All he had wanted to do was serve his community, to fix the broken pieces of a town that had been left to decay. But every time he took one step forward, it felt like the ground shifted beneath him. The sound of his phone vibrating on the table pulled him from his thoughts. It was a message from Officer Daniels. "We've got something. Meet me at the station ASAP." Jordan didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat and headed out, his stomach knotting with the anticipation of what Daniels had uncovered. The drive to the station felt endless, each second ticking by like an eternity. When he finally arrived, Daniels was waiting by the door, his face grim. "It's bad, Chief," Daniels said without preamble, his voice low. "We've got solid proof. Fisher's been running a side operation. He's been using his position to funnel information to local gangs." Jordan's blood ran cold. He had suspected something was off, but hearing the words confirmed all of his worst fears. Detective Fisher, one of the most trusted men in the department, was involved in criminal activities. It was a betrayal of the worst kind. "We've got surveillance footage," Daniels continued. "It's all there. Fisher's been meeting with known criminals, giving them intel about ongoing investigations. It's been happening for months." Jordan felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He had trusted Fisher. But now, the truth was inescapable. If the people of Oakwood found out about this, the town's fragile trust in him and the police department would be shattered. It could mean the end of everything. "Do we arrest him?" Jordan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The decision felt monumental, the kind of choice that could make or break a career. If he moved too quickly, he could ruin any chance of repairing the department's reputation. But if he hesitated, Oakwood would lose faith in him altogether. "We need to be careful," Daniels replied. "We don't have all the evidence yet. We have to make sure it's airtight before we make a move." Jordan ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small office. He knew Daniels was right. If they arrested Fisher without enough proof, it could backfire. The last thing they needed was a messy investigation that would turn the town against them. But at the same time, Jordan couldn't afford to wait. He had promised to clean up Oakwood, and the clock was ticking. "All right," Jordan said, finally. "We move forward, but we do it quietly. We get everything we need, and when we have it all, we move. If Fisher's guilty, he's done. There's no place for corruption in Oakwood, not anymore." The next few days were a blur of surveillance, interviews, and collecting evidence. Every moment felt like a race against time. Jordan had never imagined that one of his own officers would be the source of such a betrayal. He had hoped that his appointment as chief would mark a new beginning for Oakwood, a chance to rebuild trust and start fresh. But now, every step he took felt like it was leading him deeper into a tangled web of lies and corruption. As the investigation unfolded, Jordan began to realize the true scale of the problem. Fisher was just the tip of the iceberg. One morning, as Jordan reviewed the final pieces of evidence, his phone rang. It was Daniels. "Chief," Daniels said, his voice tense. "We've got him. Fisher's been meeting with the gang leaders in the outskirts of town. We've got it all." Jordan felt a wave of relief, followed quickly by dread. The trap had been set. It was time. "You know what to do," Jordan said, his voice steady. "Get him in cuffs. Make it clean." As he hung up the phone, Jordan felt a sickening weight in his stomach. This was the moment he had feared. The moment when everything could come crashing down. But he had no choice. Oakwood's future depended on him being strong, on doing what was right, no matter how painful. That evening, as Fisher was escorted out of the station in handcuffs, Jordan stood at the front of the building, watching the scene unfold. The crowd that had gathered outside watched in stunned silence. Jordan felt the eyes of the town upon him, judging, waiting to see how he would respond. This wasn't just about one bad officer. It was about everything he had promised. This was the price of change, the price of restoring integrity to a system that had been broken for too long. And as he watched Fisher being led away, Jordan knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long, filled with challenges he couldn't yet foresee. But one thing was certain, Oakwood would never be the same again. And the arrest of Detective Fisher was only the beginning of the transformation Oakwood so desperately needed. The town's pulse had quickened in the aftermath, and Jordan felt the change in the air, palpable and raw. But the road ahead was treacherous, and the dust was far from settling. The arrest had sent shockwaves through the community, but the ripple effects were deeper than he could have imagined. People who had once seen him as a symbol of hope now questioned his every move. They wondered if he could truly cleanse the rot from a department that had festered for so long. But Jordan didn't have the luxury of second-guessing himself. He had to lead with resolve, even if his heart was filled with doubt. The days following Fisher's arrest were filled with long hours of interrogation, paperwork, and more secrets unearthed. The deeper Jordan dug, the more he realized that Fisher wasn't just a rogue cop operating alone. He was part of a much larger, far-reaching network of corruption within the department, corruption that had been festering for years, hidden beneath layers of loyalty and silence. It was all connected: bribes, under-the-table deals with local criminals, and information leaked to gangs operating right under the nose of the police force. The web was vast, stretching out in ways Jordan hadn't expected, and every new discovery made him more certain of the fact that his task was not only about reforming the police department. It was about rebuilding Oakwood from the inside out. As if the weight of Fisher's betrayal wasn't enough, Jordan began receiving anonymous threats. They came in the form of cryptic letters, each one more chilling than the last. At first, he thought they were idle threats, empty words meant to scare him off. But the more he read, the more he felt the tension building. The letters warned him to stay out of things he didn't understand, to stop digging into the corruption that was so deeply entrenched in the town. It was clear that there were powerful people, both inside and outside of the department, who didn't want the truth to come to light. Either would he. Jordan couldn't let that stop him. He had promised to clean up Oakwood. He had promised that things would change. And he couldn't back down now, not when they were so close to uncovering the full extent of the rot. But the threats were a reminder that this wasn't just about fighting bad cops, it was about taking on a system that had been built over decades. A system that wasn't going to go down easily. One particularly late evening, Jordan found himself standing in front of the mirror in his office, staring at his reflection. The bags under his eyes were growing darker with each passing day, his face weary from the endless pressure of his role. But in that reflection, he saw something he hadn't seen before: determination. He wasn't going to let Oakwood fall apart. Not while he still had a chance to fix it. His resolve was tested the next morning when a new piece of information came to light. The investigation into the department's corruption had uncovered a connection between Fisher and some of the highest-ranking officials in Oakwood, officials who had used their positions to line their pockets and turn a blind eye to the crimes happening on their watch. Jordan had known that the corruption ran deep, but this revelation shook him to his core. The very men who had been entrusted with protecting the town were the ones who had betrayed it the most. It became clear that Jordan couldn't do this alone. The pressure was suffocating, and the web of deceit was tangled beyond his expertise. He reached out to the state police, asking for assistance. They had the resources, the experience, and the authority to go beyond the boundaries of Oakwood's small-town politics. When they arrived, Jordan felt a flicker of relief. He wasn't entirely on his own. The state police offered their expertise in handling corruption investigations, and with their help, Jordan knew they could take down the people who had been profiting off Oakwood's pain. But even with the added resources, the investigation was long and arduous. Every new piece of evidence uncovered a deeper layer of the conspiracy. It was almost as if Oakwood had become a cesspool of corruption, with every corrupt officer, official, and criminal feeding into the system. There were moments when Jordan felt like he was drowning in the weight of it all. How could he undo years of corruption and restore faith in a system that had been so thoroughly broken? The breakthrough came when a trusted informant from within the department came forward, someone who had been too afraid to speak out earlier. This officer, a young cop named Maria, had witnessed firsthand the underhanded dealings happening within Oakwood PD. She had watched Fisher sell information to criminal organizations, had seen officers take bribes, and had been too terrified to report it for fear of retribution. Now, with the support of Jordan and the state police, she was ready to testify. Maria's testimony was a game-changer. She had the details, the dates, the names, everything that Jordan needed to take down the corrupt officials who had been operating in the shadows for so long. But as the investigation progressed, the danger surrounding them intensified. The deeper they dug, the more resistance they faced from those in power. Threats against Jordan's life became more frequent, and his family was suddenly thrust into the crosshairs of a battle he had never anticipated. It was clear now that Oakwood's corruption wasn't just limited to the police department, it was woven into the fabric of the town itself, stretching all the way to its political leaders, its business magnates, and even its media outlets. Jordan found himself fighting not just for the soul of Oakwood but for his own survival. The investigation had turned personal. The more he uncovered, the more it became a fight for his integrity, his career, and the future of the town he had sworn to protect. But Jordan didn't back down. The threat of danger, the weight of betrayal, none of it could make him waver. Every new obstacle only fueled his determination. He was going to expose the truth, no matter what it cost him. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined, but for the first time, he could see a clear path forward, a path that would cleanse Oakwood of the rot that had taken hold of it. In the coming weeks, the tide began to turn. The corrupt officials who had once thought they were untouchable began to feel the pressure. The state police had gathered enough evidence to launch a full-scale operation. There were arrests, investigations, and a series of public trials that would expose the town's darkest secrets. The once thriving criminal network that had infiltrated Oakwood was dismantled, piece by piece. But the cost was high. Jordan's reputation was now tied to every aspect of the scandal. Every action he took, every decision he made, was scrutinized. It was a challenge to his integrity at every turn. In the midst of the investigation, a pivotal moment occurred that shook Jordan to his core. One evening, as he sat at his desk going over the final details of the case, he received a phone call from his wife, Lisa. Her voice was shaky, and the words she spoke made Jordan's blood run cold. "Jordan, they've found something," she said, her voice cracking with fear. "There's a car outside the house, watching us. They know we're getting too close." His heart pounded in his chest. The threats had just escalated to a terrifying level. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about his family's safety. The people he loved most were now caught in the crossfire. With his family at risk, Jordan knew that he had to act fast. He couldn't let the people who had corrupted Oakwood destroy everything he had worked for, everything the town had worked for. It was time to go all in. He gathered his most trusted officers, including Maria, and began coordinating the final stages of the investigation. The city was on the brink of upheaval, but Jordan was ready to face whatever came next. The battle was no longer about clearing his name or proving his worth, it was about doing the right thing, no matter the cost. Oakwood deserved to be free of the corruption that had plagued the storm that had been building for weeks finally broke. The weeks of mounting pressure, sleepless nights, and relentless investigations had led to this moment. Jordan stood at the threshold of a new chapter for Oakwood, but it was a chapter filled with uncertainty and danger. As the evidence stacked up and the corruption within the department and beyond was brought into the light, Oakwood found itself at the crossroads of its future. Jordan knew the road ahead would be paved with opposition, threats, and likely the loss of many personal relationships, but he also knew that it was the only road to redemption. For too long, Oakwood had been held hostage by a broken system, and it was his duty to restore order, even at great personal cost. Jordan had to act quickly now. The situation with his family had become far too dangerous to ignore. The phone calls, the taunting letters, and now the strange car parked in front of his house were all signs that the forces at play would stop at nothing to protect the corrupt network they had built. As the chief of police, Jordan had spent his career being a protector of the people, but now, for the first time, he found himself in need of protection. The danger was no longer just a shadow, it was at his doorstep, threatening not only his own life but the safety of his wife, his children, and anyone who dared to stand with him. He knew that to protect those he loved, he had to bring this fight to its bitter end. It for far too long, and Jordan was willing to pay the price for that freedom. The state police had gathered all the evidence they needed. The tangled web of corruption within the police force, the involvement of local politicians, and the criminal network that had infiltrated Oakwood was finally exposed. The corruption ran deep, much deeper than Jordan had initially thought. It wasn't just a few bad apples. It was a system, a culture of silence, fear, and betrayal that had festered for decades. Jordan had uncovered things that shook him to his core: officers taking bribes, manipulating investigations, and allowing dangerous criminals to walk free in exchange for money or favors. The people in power had used their positions to line their pockets while the citizens of Oakwood suffered. Now, with the weight of the truth in his hands, Jordan had a responsibility to make sure it didn't stay hidden any longer. But exposing the truth came with consequences. Every move Jordan made was being watched. He knew that with each step, he was not only putting his career at risk but also putting Oakwood at risk. The town had already been through so much, and the thought of it all crumbling under the weight of scandal was unbearable. But he couldn't stop now. If he gave in, if he allowed the people who had stolen from Oakwood to walk free, it would mean that everything he had done, everything he had sacrificed, was for nothing. He had to see it through. The arrests were swift and brutal. The state police moved in, coordinating with Jordan's department, to take down the criminals who had infiltrated the force. As they raided offices, homes, and storage facilities, the truth came crashing down. The names on the list were shocking, some of them familiar faces that Jordan had known for years, trusted colleagues who had helped build his career. The realization that he had been deceived by people he had once considered family was a bitter pill to swallow. Yet, it was necessary. In the wake of the arrests, there was a sense of disbelief that washed over the town. People couldn't believe the extent of the betrayal. The very institution meant to protect them had been corrupted from the inside out. The community reacted in a mix of anger, relief, and confusion. There were those who felt betrayed by the men and women who had sworn an oath to protect and serve. They demanded justice and accountability, and for the first time, Jordan felt the weight of that expectation pressing down on him. He had become a symbol of change, and the people's faith in him was a fragile thing. One wrong move could shatter everything he had worked for. He couldn't let that happen. In the wake of the arrests, Jordan was thrust into a whirlwind of media attention. Reporters camped outside his office, clamoring for sound bites and statements. The pressure from the public and from within the department itself was intense. Some of his own officers questioned whether he had gone too far, whether he had risked everything for an investigation that could unravel the entire town. Jordan had to stand firm, though. He had already come this far, and there was no turning back. But as the days turned into weeks, Jordan began to notice that the resistance wasn't just from within the department. It was from the town itself. Old habits die hard, and Oakwood had been living with the specter of corruption for so long that many people didn't know how to react to the truth. Some of the townspeople were afraid of the unknown, afraid that the town's institutions would crumble without the very people who had kept the peace, even if that peace had been built on lies. There was fear in the streets, fear of the upheaval that might follow the revelations of corruption. Jordan had to lead through this fear, but it wasn't easy. As he continued to navigate the complex fallout, the stakes were raised. A new figure emerged in Oakwood, someone who had been operating in the shadows, someone with enough power and influence to sway public opinion and derail the investigation. The deeper Jordan dug, the more he realized that Oakwood's corruption had not only been rooted in the police force but also in its political and business structures. Powerful figures who had managed to keep their hands clean by manipulating the system from behind the scenes were now working to discredit him, to make him the scapegoat for everything that had gone wrong. They had the resources, the connections, and the influence to mount a full-scale attack on his career, and they weren't about to let him destroy everything they had built. Jordan's family continued to be caught in the crossfire. The threats had escalated, his wife Lisa had received anonymous phone calls, and there had been more suspicious cars parked near their home. It was clear that Jordan's commitment to exposing the truth had made him a target, and Oakwood's corrupt elite weren't going to stop until he was destroyed. But Jordan wasn't backing down. The cost was high, but it was a price he was willing to pay. he couldn't let the truth be buried any longer. With every passing day, the investigation grew more dangerous, and the pressure on Jordan reached new heights. Yet, he stood resolute, surrounded by the few remaining officers who hadn't turned their backs on the mission. Maria, the officer who had first come forward to expose Fisher's crimes, was by his side, helping him navigate the dangerous terrain of the department's unraveling structure. Together, they began gathering the final pieces of evidence needed to dismantle the corrupt political machine that had been feeding off Oakwood's misery. The final confrontation came when Jordan was faced with a difficult decision. The people in power who had been pulling the strings, the ones who had turned Oakwood into their personal fiefdom, were making their move. They tried to bribe Jordan, offering him everything from money to political power, anything that might sway him to drop the investigation. But Jordan knew that the future of Oakwood depended on this moment. If he gave in now, everything he had worked for would have been in vain. With Maria and a select few officers who were loyal to the cause, Jordan launched the final operation. The town was thrown into chaos as the corrupt officials were arrested one by one. The streets were filled with police, media, and concerned citizens who had been waiting for this moment. The corruption was finally being purged from the town, and the people of Oakwood could breathe a little easier. But as the dust settled and the arrests were made, Jordan knew that Oakwood's healing had only just begun. The scars of corruption ran deep, and it would take years to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. But he was ready. Oakwood had been through the darkest of times, and now it was up to him to lead them into a new era, one where integrity and justice would take root and flourish. As Jordan stood in front of the police station, watching the sun set on the horizon, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The fight was far from over, but the town had taken its first step toward redemption. And for the first time in a long time, Jordan felt that he had truly made a difference. Oakwood would never be the same, but in some ways, that was exactly what it needed. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he was ready to face it. After all, he wasn't just fighting for the town, he was fighting for its future. And that was a fight he would never back down from.